Can everybody put in chat where you're coming from? California, Edinburgh, Los Angeles, India, Portugal, South Carolina, India, France. Cool. England, Baltic states, Philippines. Coffee cup number 5. So so I'm getting close to, I think, toxic levels of caffeine. But I'll try to speak as slowly as I can. Can you all see my screen okay? Everything great here?
Yep, yep.
Great. All right, so today we're going to talk about how accessibility is testability. So a little bit about me. I work at CrowdStrike on the developer experience test tooling team. And I'm also a K6 champion, technically a Grafana champion, which is a load testing tool that's useful for kind of browser-based and front-end based testing, and also a Playwright champion, which is a great functional test automation framework and uses in all the different languages. I do want to say that the what I'll be demonstrating will be using Playwright today. But nothing that I'm going to be talking about is specific to Playwright. The concepts are kind of universal. I do want to just asterisk that at the beginning. But a little bit about my history. I've been working in web testing for a little over 15 years, specifically working in the open source space most recently. I've worked at Ansible, Red Hat, on the Jenkins project at CloudBees. And then most recently, had a rare opportunity to work at an open source NASA project at the NASA Ames Research Center, and that'll be the foundation of what we talk about today. And that project is called OpenMCT. So we're not going to have enough time to go over OpenMCT but we're just going to use it as the context for web accessibility testing. It's here on GitHub. I hope everybody come and check it out. Um, and give it a star. Take it a look. There's some great um, um, patterns for test automation, for visual testing, performance testing. There's some really great stuff in here, and I'd recommend that everybody take a look and play around with it. But I would basically describe it as an open source web framework that's used for doing higher telemetry data um, and visualization of that data than you could get in something like Grafana. So when precision matters, you need to do something very frequent or have large bursty amounts of data. OpenMCT is really the best way that I know to visualize that data, make decisions based off of those visualizations um, in the web or in the browser, I should say. But it is open source. So one of the things that's really interesting is we had a GitHub discussion one day. It just said, out of the blue, Miles B. Jackson said, "So we've modified this to run in the cloud, and ingesting 60,000 data points per second, right? And when you click on the link, what you get is a surprise, a video from the Oracle Formula One racing team. And Max Verstappen turns out is a user, I think, of OpenMCT, and his team is at least. And what you're seeing here is him driving in the sim, and you're seeing an overlay of the telemetry that's being either read by him or his team in OpenMCT. So it's a really high performance view. And of course, the trash collector is coming by right now, so it might be a little noisy for a little bit. Sorry about that. Um, but yeah, we have, you can see on the right, you can see a gauge that's being updated in real time. Yeah, no, really big surprise, but one of the benefits of working in the open source. And so what I'm going to do really quick is show how it might have been used. So I have it running locally here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the create button. I'm going to go to dashboard to create a dashboard similar to what he had. Let's see. display layout, and I'm going to see that we have a title and a form. I'm going to type in title, click on this. You see how we have the search bar? I'm going to search for my items. Note we have one search bar here, one up here, technically. It's important to come up later. So I've created an object. I'm going to save the object. I'm going to create one more object called a gauge, and I'm going to put it into our title object here, right? And now we have a gauge, very similar to what Max had on his display, right? And so that workflow of clicking a create button, creating a layout, and then adding a component to it is kind of the core of what OpenMCT is. It's a way of visualizing data without needing to code. So today what we're going to talk about is, kind of my accessibility journey, how that relates to web testability. I swear we'll get to that very quickly. Some web accessibility rules and standards and patterns. Some of the lessons learned on my journey so far, and talk about the future. It's really, really exciting. So I really hope you all stick around. So let's start with the journey. I think my journey really starts in accessibility with a audit that was performed at a company that I was working at in 2016. Before that, I really hadn't given it any sort of consideration. We just got this, 15 to 20 page report of all of the problems that we needed to do to make our web page more accessible. And it took quite a bit of work to kind of update it. We hadn't really thought about it until that point. So it was an interesting thing to take into account in the dev team. But when I joined Ansible Red Hat specifically, one of the cool things they had is we used a Patternfly design library. So the design library itself actually was tested to be accessible, and Ansible and the different parts of Red Hat sourced that, right? And so if you sourced effectively a audited design and audited components, web components, then implicitly your application became accessible, right? It's a really great pattern. And so I was, again, aware of everything, but I didn't even really have to worry about it, right? Um, and then I was more or less aware of this thing called the Section 508 requirement, which is something that kind of came up when I started working at a federal agency like NASA Ames Research Center, right? So the Section 508 is a federal mandate that affects web applications to make sure that they must be compliant with some level of web accessibility, right? And so that's when it became a requirement for me, right? So I'm a tester, right? I'm testing something that I need to take into account and really consider. And I got to do this in the open source, right? So I got to figure out how to do this in the open. I can't do all of these audits all of the time, right? I can't, it wouldn't really scale that way. So what I had to do is come up with a test strategy, right? So this is my journey, my test strategy. We have dozens of downstream, we had at that time dozens of downstream consumers of OpenMCT, right? There's like 19 different missions. And then, of course, the Oracle Formula One racing team, right? And they were downstream. So we were the component library, we were the framework, we were everything upstream, and they sourced us downstream. So they had all of our plugins here fed into their design, but they also had their own, right? And they hosted it on their own. So my automated functional test strategy had to take this into account, right? In addition to my accessibility. Um, and so I started to think about, for functional test automation, how would the page object model work in this, right? If I have a page object model here, and they're writing their own tests for their own application, right? How would they source them upstream? What would that even look like, right? So should I, in addition to that, should I mark up the entire application to make it more testable by adding things like data test IDs? Should I do that everywhere, right? Something to consider. And it caused kind of like an existential crisis. What good is a page object model in JavaScript if the downstream testers use Python Selenium, right? What is a page if everything is composable, right? There's no page in a page object model if what Max sees, what I see, what mission operators see is different and composed, right? So do I mark up the entire web application with NASA data test ID, right? What do I do? How do I make the application more testable, right? So like look at how different Max's view of the world is versus our example demo layout, right? There's multiple there's multiple copies of the same thing. So there's no page really to test in the traditional sense. These are just various components that can be, plugged in as what you see is what you get WYSIWYG. So all of that is happening. I'm losing sleep at night, right? Trying to figure out how I'm going to do this. At the same time that Playwright 127 landed. That's about the time I said I was a Playwright ambassador. That's about the time that Kent C. Dodds joined the project. And when he joined, there was this shift from to user-facing locators, right? So user-facing locators was disruptive to me because my entire app until that point was using something similar to this, page.locator, right? So it was very disruptive that the new definition of everything changed. The new API for interacting and locating elements on the page changed. But it was a good thing. I'll say it was a very good thing. And so what I wanted to show you is kind of like this is the OpenMCT create button that we interacted with, and what it would look like if I clicked on the button with the various location strategies. So I think we're all, familiar with like CSS, XPath locators, that sort of thing. But this is what I'm going to show you is the relationship between the two. So here, this is the ID on the create button label, right? And this is what the test code would look like, page.locator create button label. IDs are great. They're not always unique, right? They don't absolutely need to be. They're pretty good. This is another way of getting to the element at clicking on a button. Page.locator, you do locator chaining, you do CSS chaining. This is a real problem because this could be different depending on the styles. This could be different if somebody that was using OpenMCT modified any of these class names, right? So it's not a very good locator. So a very common strategy until 2017 was to use the data test ID. So mark up the entire application with these invisible components, right? Like create button, right? And so that's what that would look like in place. And what you get is a very stable locator, right? You get a very stable locator. But what Playwright did was introduce user facing locators. And what they did is they changed it so you get something by the role here. You see how there's a relationship here between button, the role here. Do you all see that? And then the name, the create name here. So that fundamentally changed the way that all of our tests were written, and it changed our mindset. And it changed my mindset in my direction. So let me show you kind of what that looks like here. So I'll just do it really quickly. What I have here is the Playwright recorder. So I'm going to record interactions here. I'm going to click on the create button. You see how it says get by role button create, right? So I'm going to click on that. And then the test code looks like await page get by role button create, right? And then when I go into here, look at this. So I'm going to go to that display layout. You see how it says get by role menu item, right? And then display layout, right? And then the rest follows. A text box. There's a search modal here for my items, right? And then boom. So we're here. So this is what the role looks like here, right? You see this? And then this is what the Playwright is selecting as the most unique way of identifying that element. So there's a relationship here between the components on the page, their roles, and how they're available. Okay. So I realized, based off of the amount of time that I had, based off of all the constraints, all the things that were unique to my project, being open source with downstream testers and everything, right? What if instead of marking up the entire application, I enforce user-facing locators upstream with linting rules, right? What if I do that? What if I disallow the use of the page object model upstream in the main project to enforce the development, to force the developers and the testing all to take these user-facing locators and enforce this into the application, right? Because there is no POM, because there is no page if people are, developing their own ways of viewing data, right? What if I disallow that? And what if each time I write a test, I leave the app more accessible than I found it, right? So every time I'm working with these components, what if I make sure that each of those components is a little bit more accessible to the accessibility standard, right? And learn about accessibility along the way, right? And it worked. So that was my strategy. Those were my constraints, right? Open source, closed source, upstream, downstream, components, JavaScript, Selenium, everything. Those were my constraints. And at the end of the project, it all worked. So it had all of the effects that we needed. We passed Section 508 criteria with flying colors, right? We had everything that we needed in the testing and the testability, right? It's very easy for downstream projects to source this and make very testable code and absorb changes to OpenMCT, right, upstream. But yeah, please don't leave. Please don't leave yet. There's way more to talk about. So I'm going to take a moment here just to make sure that this is seen as interactive. Does anybody have any comments or questions that I can answer at this time?
Hey, hey, John, I don't see any open questions
Okay,
as of now.
great. Great. I'm trying to, okay. Can you all see the chat screen? Is it obscuring it or is it hidden? Trying to move it off to the side here. I'll take that as it's hidden. Great. Okay. So let's now pivot. That's my journey in the success of using this strategy. But let's talk about web testability and what that means, right? So web testability, I define it as making sure that the tests interact with the web page without limitations or asterisks. That is to say, you should be able to click on a button and know that when you click on the button, certain events are fired, certain interactions take place, and you shouldn't have to make all of these polyfill shims to say, when I click this button, wait on this event, put a wait for timeout, do this thing, and then depending on when and how you clicked on this button, it behaves this way, and put all of that noise into the test code base, right? Just make it very explicit, deterministic, and avoid any of the page object model, affordances, which is the ability to interact with the page with very complicated logic, right? Make it very simple. Um, we should be able to read the page content and state to know what's on it and the state of those things, right? Very simple. And the most important thing, I think, even though it's not number one, is we should be able to uniquely identify elements on the page, right? So to have very stable tests, you need to make sure that when you identify something on the page, that it'll be the same run over run, build over build, release over release, feature over feature, right? And the tests survive and they don't drift, they don't fail when they shouldn't, right? Those are the key things here. And it turns out that web accessibility has some of the very exact same concerns, right? So assistive tools that interact with a web page need to be able to do that without limitations or asterisks, right? If somebody that's low vision or blind needs to work with OpenMCT or any other compliant web application, right? There shouldn't need to be any limitations in what you can do, what you can know, or what you can achieve, right, with an assistive tool. They need to know, and in order to do that, they need to know about the web page's content and state. Assistive technologies need to tell the user what a create button is and what you can do with it, right? And if it's available or if it's not available, right? So an example of that is here, right? If I create this, look, this is now marked as unavailable, right? It's now hidden to me visually, but at the same time, it needs to be hidden from the assistive tool, right? So we happen to know that this is now marked as disabled to the tool and disabled to the tests because we shouldn't be able to re-click on that, right? So there's a lot of overlap there. And the main thing is web accessibility needs to uniquely identify elements on the page, right? In order to know what you're doing, you need to be able to uniquely identify elements on the page. Um, and then there's one more thing that we're going to spend a little bit of this talk talking about is that low vision users can discern components visually, right? So there's some contrast things to take into account that we'll talk about. So this is a very difficult thing to demonstrate in a recorded session. So what I've done is I've taken OpenMCT in a browser. I've taken the Mac OS screen reader tool, VoiceOver, and I've captured how I would navigate through the web application, recorded it, and what I'm going to do is press play. Unfortunately, there's no other way of doing this that I found. And what you're going to do is, before we do it, let me talk about it. For those of you who are not familiar, so VoiceOver tools allow low vision and blind users to be able to understand what's going on their page, the web page, right? And they'll do that by broadcasting information. So down here, if you all can see this, this is the text that is being read aloud, voiced over, right? But this is a visual version of that. So if you're deaf or hard of hearing, this is what you would key off of to understand what's going on as well, right? Um, and so this gives us a visual indication as to what is being broadcasted in the screen reader software, right? And there's nothing unique about this versus JAWS versus anything else that's worth mentioning, right? They're more or less the same. Um, but what you're going to see me do is you're going to see me walk through the application without a mouse. So that's one of the primary things is there's no mouse involved. In order to test this properly, you're going to need to navigate by tabbing with the tab key and moving your arrow keys around the application, right? So a very different way of using web applications. So here we go. Browse bar, my items grid view, empty, table, Chrome, back. So right there. We've now entered into the context of Chrome. Back. My items grid view, search input. So what we have here is it's saying search input, search text field, OpenMCT search. So this is what is being broadcast to a low vision user to describe what it is and how you can use it. And so this is the metadata that we've added, or that we at the time, I'm no longer part of the project. We at the time had added to the element to make sure that the voiceover worked. Start create. So you see this? Create button group. So we're going to use create button the rest of this time to talk about the create button, right? As an example. So it knows what the button is. It's in a group. And when you click on the create button, it has this button effect. Group. So I've clicked on it by hitting enter, right? And look at what it says. You are currently on a button group inside of a web content. And then it gives me, illustration of what would happen next. And there's a problem here. I don't know if you can tell. It's not going into the drop down to tell me a list of everything that's there. I have to do that manually. You are currently on a button group inside of exam modal. So in order to click that, I actually had to click that with my mouse. But I cannot tab into it. And that's really one of the things that's interesting about Section 508 is that the definition of what that means is being able to pass these auditing tools. And in this particular case, at the time that this was recorded, it wasn't a very good accessible experience. I would have to jump in and manually click something. There's no native way of navigating to those elements in the dropdown, which isn't a violation. It's not a violation, at least in the view of the law, but it is not a good accessible experience. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I'm going to move on. But it'll basically allow me to go through this, read what's going on, and know how to interpret everything to a screen reader. So we saw the button, right? We saw the button. And so let's go back through what the user-facing locators meant in this context, right? So when you're writing a test, you can use the ID, you can use the CSS, you can use a locator, again, That's really interesting. Did you all hear it say anything about a create button label? No, it didn't. Did you hear anything about CSS? No. It turns out that there is no CSS when it comes to screen readers. When taking into account how elements are perceived in the screen readers, completely ignore CSS. It doesn't exist. There's no data test ID, right? There's no way for it to know what that is and what to do with it, right? Only the test would know. So, but it does know what button is. Remember, it said create button. It broadcasted create button because it knew what a button was. It knew what the create text meant, all right? It was a name, computed name field, right? And so what the tests do in Playwright now is they go through the same paths. I would think of it as the same paths as accessible um, tools, right? So let's take one quick look at this of what this would actually look like. So if I pull up OpenMCT here, let's go back to it, and I pull up the wave tool. Um, uh-oh. Oh, it's here. Okay. When I pull up the wave tool, I would recommend that everybody go and pull this down. What you can do with it is see all of the violations on the page, right? Contrast violations in context, everything that you would ever need to do, and get very contextual, procedural understanding of what's wrong, what you need to do. And look, like I said, no errors, right? Fantastic. It took a lot of work to get there. But we're going to turn off all of these details, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do something interesting. I'm going to show you what a screen reader sees. That's what a screen reader sees. This now is the application without CSS. So I'm going to go back to the create button. Can you all see that? See the create button right there? That's interactive. That's OpenMCT running without CSS. I hit create by hitting tab, and look, um, at the bottom of the page are the list of all of the things that I can now interact with, right? Remember how I said that they weren't rendering exactly on screen? You can't tab into it. And this is an example of that. The tab order here is violated. I can't go from the create button into here. And this is a problem, right? This is easily fixable, but this is a problem, right? And then if I go into here, I can search, right? But yeah, that's what OpenMCT looks like without uh, without CSS. But yeah, this is a great tool. Everybody should pull it down, take a look at well, how this all works. Um, but yeah, okay. And I'm going to save the next topic, accessibility tree, for the end, just because of not time, but because of context. But we'll talk about that in a little bit. Um, okay. So that's how screen readers view OpenMCT, right? And how the tests kind of relate to that, and why there's a interplay there. And it really comes down to web accessibility standards are only looking for basic semantics like button, right? A button is a protected thing that's been a part of the HTML specification for a long time. And so screen readers know what to do with it in the same way that Playwright and Selenium and all of these testing tools know what to do with it, right? And where there's a gap, we're going to show one gap. When there's a gap, there's a lot of them, but when there's a gap, ARIA roles can fill in the gap. So like the gauge component, remember that we created, it has a meter. There's a meter role that doesn't exist in the HTML specification, something that you can fill in. And for everything else, you can use ARIA labels to mark up all of your interactive components, right? So anything that is interactive, that you would want to interact with in your tests, that you would want to interact with a screen reader, can be given ARIA labels. Um, and we want everything to be uniquely identifiable on the page, right? So when it's telling us create button and when it's telling us all the different components that are available on the page, we want to know what that is in context so we know what to expect when we interact with it, right? So let's jump into the gauge example, right? Oh, let's jump into the gauge example, right? And then I'll pause for some questions after this. So we have the gauge example. So this is the gauge code, right? Um, And this is something that I want to say there's a little bit more that we get when we use these accessible properties. So remember, this is the gauge we created, and this is the gauge that Max and his team created, right? Remember that? So where we get ourselves uh, where this gets interesting, right, is we can write a test that uses the role meter, and this is what it looks like in Playwright, right? Meter. And then we can get some data property here called name that matches what Max's name of his element is in context. And then our tests then can then use that property to then identify that uniquely on the page, right? So by biasing this, that means a screen reader would say meter object um, max for stopping too fast. It would read that, right? And then know what to do with it, right? And what it would do with it is this. It would start to tell you the ranges of what the range is here, 0, right? You see that? And it does that through an accessible property that you can then see called toHave attribute ARIA value min. So think about that. When you're writing a test for this component, right? A test, you would want to know that when you create a new one that starts at 0 and ends at 100, right? And so one way to do that is to write a test that you expect the gauge one properties to have this attribute ARIA value of 0 as a means to test the component itself, right? So range low is already visually made to the user. Now it's made to the screen reader. So the screen reader, when you go on to the gauge, will read off this information in the min value, max value, and and the current value, right? So this is just an additional thing that you get when you go down this route of um, ARIA and accessibility. You start to get testing metadata, right? You start to get things that you can key off of in your test that make very clean, simple, valuable tests, right? And you're reinforcing accessible patterns, right? If this doesn't work, it's a functional bug, right? That this didn't start off with 0, right? That's a functional bug. All right. So I said I would stop. So does anybody have are there any questions that I could field at this time before
Uh,
continuing?
yes, John, there are two questions in the chat and one more question in the Q&A section. Or do you want me to read it out or
Yes,
what's
if
more
you wouldn't mind,
comfortable?
yeah, if you wouldn't mind reading it.
Yeah. Okay, so I think this was asked about 10 minutes ago, but does this mean you have to access to the website source code? What if, so it just got scrolled down. There's someone, sorry. Does this mean you have to access to the website source code? What if you're using a vendor CMS?
Windows CMS. I'm not sure what Windows CMS is. I'm sorry. Is that like a uh, is that like another browser standard Windows CMS? Let me see. Vendor
Okay, it's a
CMS.
content management system.
Um, like Sitefinity. Yeah, so you all of this, if you're trying to, so yeah, exactly. So what you would be asking for is that the vendor themselves make their app more testable. That's what you would be asking for, I guess, is was one way of interpreting that question. If you don't have what you need, you can identify what you don't have. So on my current team, what we do is when we're writing these tests and we notice we're making a really ugly locator, right? When we're doing something, let's go over here. If we notice that we're doing this, uh, let's see. Um, if we notice that we're doing something like this, let me go to the terminal. I'm not exactly sure how I would write this down, but if we notice that we're doing a bad locator, if we notice we're doing something wrong, we file a bug ticket, and it's a testability ticket, right? So if we notice that we're doing something that doesn't use these accessible properties, we file an issue to come back to and leave it in line, right? So what it would look like is, well, I'm not going to do it, but it would look like, let me put it into chat. Um, so everyone, so if it doesn't look like this, but it looks like this, um, uh, uh, a group, uh, and then like dot first dot click, then we file a bug. And then that then becomes something that we track and then we take upstream. So we also take white or vendored components, white label components. And so when we notice a testability against those teams, we also work with them to make it more testable. Yeah. Um, Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so exactly. So you would identify, and then the real thing is that, the challenge here is knowing what you're asking for, right? So a lot of times you'll ask for a data test ID against this thing. And what I would recommend in the era of AI is if you do have some version of the source code, if you do have something to reference in your tests or by downloading it, the raw markup. Um, uh, Ask Gen AI to help identify what's wrong with the component or prevents you from accessing it in the way that you need. Um, yeah. So let's talk about this. Oh man, I can't get my screen. Um, let's talk about the intersection here. Let's talk about the intersection here. So we have accessibility on the left and testability on the right, a Venn diagram, right? So on the left, we have visual testing. So for accessibility, there's a lot of things that you need to take into account, like contrast, right? But that's mostly visual, right? And so there's a lot of patterns, a lot of things that are, specific to accessibility that don't fall into this overlap that we're talking about. There's a lot of accessibility concerns. Keyboard navigation is one of them, right? You could write a test to validate keyboard navigation easily. You could easily do that, but that doesn't really matter for automated functional tests, right? You wouldn't really want to file a bug there. Um, you wouldn't want to validate necessarily all the different key press scenarios with the different, arrow functions, right? Or tabbing. You wouldn't need to, right? And then there's this whole pattern of urgency and alerting of when you save something, you get like an alert dialog up here. You want to test that, but you don't want to necessarily test the behavior of how of what occurs there. These are just some things that are more of the accessibility concerns. And then um, on the right side, we have testability concerns like mouse interactions, like being able to double click on something, right? That doesn't have anything to do with the world of accessibility. CSS class names are example that, that CSS works in his renders and does whatever it needs. Doesn't matter to the world of accessibility, but it outside of visual testing, but you do need to test your components, and you need to test that they have the properties that they have in terms of size, right? In terms of like if you have a CSS property that adjusts, um, uh, you know, a certain scenario of like the loading, right? The loading view of it and how that's applied. That's something that you would need to know. Um, and then there's a lot of browser events that don't apply to accessibility at all. So there's things you just aren't the concern of accessibility that are the concern of functional tests. But there's a lot of overlap, and that's what today's talk is about. So you remember uniquely identifiable elements, and I'm going to show an example about that right now. A screen reader needs to tell the user what they're looking at, or what they've got selected, and what's going to happen, and how that's different from the other things on the screen. It's got to be very predictable. It's got to be uniquely identifiable. So that means that you got to be very careful about anything that has to do with the nth order, right? If you're following the DOM structure, and that's what you're reporting off of in your tests, right? If your tests are using the nth order for something to find it, that's probably not uniquely identifiable. That's probably a code smell. That's probably something to say that you don't have the accessibility patterns that you need, and you don't have the testability to make sure that your test is robust and resilient as you want it to be. Then we have the concern that it's human readable. So test code itself can get very, difficult to read, difficult to understand what you're doing, right? Depending on how you structure your function names, click button and then expect behavior, right? It gets really gnarly. And if you go back to just using raw locators, and you're using good accessible properties, it becomes very easy to understand what the test is doing, right? You're clicking on the create button, right? That's very obvious what you're doing. Um, and then you have additional metadata, right? Like the gauge. There's things that matter to screen readers, like how to describe the values that's being displayed, and then how to test that those values are there and correct, right? There's a lot of overlap. So let's talk about one of the things that kind of came out of this work when it comes to um, one of the nice things that kind of came out of this that is that kind of in the, I'll just say it's on this left-hand side for visual testing. And then I'll talk about why that isn't actually too far-fetched in terms of why it would actually fit in the middle. So contrast changes. So in order to meet Section 508 criteria, there's rules and patterns that are changing about the contrast of elements on the page. So this is an example of text on the background, right? You can see how this is a little difficult to read, right? It's not as clear as it could be. So, um, in order to really bump up the contrast, um, we did this. You see, we took the black to be blacker. We brought the grays in between, and then we brought the whites up, right? So we added all the contrast, and now you can see how much clearer this is to see, right? See how much clearer that is in the application. Um, so that's an example of contrast and the effects that contrast had. And that leads me right into the unexpected benefits of this strategy that I employed and that I'm continuing to use today. Um, mission operators benefited from the visual clarity improvements, right? When we increased the contrast, what we made it is clear for people that are low vision or low vision, but in effect, we also made it clear for those that 20/20 vision, working with the application in a mission operation, right? So there was a lot of benefit to that, and we were able. One of the other primary benefits is the application migrated from Angular to Vue 3 without code churn. What it came out of this is that the user-facing locators in the test were more abstracted away from the way that the application was coded and more interested in what the user was supposed to do, right? And what was supposed to happen. So you can make large leaps in application changes without touching the test, which is crazy to think about, right? But that's what happens, right? The screen readers are going to use the app in the same way, right? But the work underneath is going to change. Um, and then it became easier to onboard people, right? It's much easier to write tests this way, right? It's much easier to write tests this way. Um, Much easier to write tests this way. And so when this kind of became the canary in the coal mine here, really. If something didn't work well, like this one, look at this one. Here's a problem. The grid, I don't know what we clicked on, but yeah, the div nth, right? The screen reader would read grid object unnamed display layout, right? But I don't know what I'm clicking on in here, right? It's not necessarily the best experience, and the tests itself would change, right? But this is pretty good to work with, right? And most of these are, right? So the canary in the coal mine is for accessibility and testability issues is um, how this works, right? So you can see, look at what happens here. This is exactly what I wanted to talk about. So you see how the create button is no longer called create button. You see how it's called locator div filter has text? That's a perfectly valid indicator of what that element is in the DOM, right? Very totally valid, right? Because it is, but it has the HTML property disabled. So screen readers don't read it, right? Because it's disabled, right? They don't want you to interact with it, right? In the same way, the test shouldn't be interacting with a button that doesn't click, right? See that? The button had these properties, but when those properties changed to become inaccessible, right? Look at that. The create button properties changed, right? And so things came up like, look at this. This is the way it used to look. And then this is the way, we were able to modify it here. So add didn't really make a lot of sense contextually. And so while we were in there updating all the interactive properties, we went back to the documentation and see what we called this thing and then added these properties, add drawing object. Much clearer to me what that meant, much clearer to you, it was somebody with no context, right? And much clearer to screen readers as what was going to happen when you did the thing. Um, so let's talk about, we're running out of time, so let's go. I want to get to the end and talk to you about it, but um, what I would say, lessons learned, don't hesitate and don't boil the ocean. Start small, start once, start something, right? Do one thing at a time. You don't even need to prioritize it, right? Just start with the one thing. If you're writing a new test, right? Take the time to understand why you have a bad locator. It took about 2 years and 50% of me. I don't know if that's worthwhile to anybody, but that's something to scope. It's not going to happen instantly. One of the things to share is that I wish I didn't know much about it, and had to become an expert along the way, is I wish I would have shared what I learned with the developers more regularly. That's just me being scared because I knew I wasn't the expert, right? And I didn't want to present on something that was like, this is what this should be, or this is what this should be, right? Because if they came and asked me more about it, I wouldn't be able to defend the decisions necessarily because I'm not a front-end developer, right? I don't know exactly why it would be one way or the other. And so I wish I would have started this conversation earlier and had the devs start to share what they learned and what they know about it and say, hey, I'm having a hard time finding this element. Do you know why? Right? Well, I wish I had started the conversation that way. Um, and then in addition to that, um, I did too many ARIA labels. So ARIA implies interactivity, but you should just start with the basic components, right? They shouldn't be everywhere. You can't add ARIA labels to things that are not interactive, right? And so some of the things I did was to mark up the app in ways that I had to remove, right? So don't just fall to an ARIA label, right? Fall to the basics of the HTML5 properties, then fall right to the roles, right? The roles that fill in the gaps from ARIA roles, then go to ARIA labels, right? That's kind of the sequence. Um, and then I want to talk about how this approach doesn't mean you pass an audit, right? An audit will fail remember the create button drop down? It'll fail. Um, and so I'm going to ask everybody in chat right now, tell me how you think this, if I added three create buttons in chat, can you tell me what you think a screen reader will read? Can you go into chat right now and write what you think a screen reader will read when if it had to present these three when you tab between? Let's see. I'll look in chat. Yes, ED, you got it. Create button, create button, create button, create button. Yeah, create button, create button, create button, right? It'll do that over and over. But what you would want to have, the thing I wanted to call out, if you do an automated accessibility audit, it'll pass, right? Because this is all valid HTML that the scraper can pass, but not a good experience, right? So automated accessibility scans can only detect really simple violations against certain rule sets. So what you would want to do is you would want to go into the button property and modify the second create name to be something like create display type, right? This doesn't exist. This is a fictional example, but something that I've seen in my past. So stop talking about the past and talk about the really exciting future here. So the Playwright project added their own MCP server. And what's really interesting about this is the way that screen readers interact with the world is now going to be the way that AI interacts with the world. AI is going to use the accessibility tree. So let's pull this up. So Playwright now, and others do this as well, like Aluminium HQ, and there's some other ones. But here's the DOM, right? Really messy, right? Like really messy, right? A lot of going on, diffs, ifs, all that kind of stuff, right? ARIA labels, all this sort of stuff. But if you click this little guy here, boom, what you get is the simplified view of the world. You get the simplified thing, create button, right? Everything becomes basically what the screen reader reads, right? Very simple. And in fact, if you write your test to look for these things, this is what your tests see, right? And so the MCP server by Playwright, the official one, actually uses this tree as the way to tell the LLM what is going on in the DOM, right? Strips away all the CSS, strips away everything, because it turns out that the same things that screen readers need, that tests need, is the same thing that AI needs to understand what's going on inside of web applications. So you could write a AI LLM tool a test that says go to homepage and create gauge and verify min value, right? Uh, and it would do that and it would use it through the accessibility tree. So just to summarize, if you're going to implement a location strategy for test, you should use user-centric, stable, and specific locators. Accessibility checks all of those boxes, remember? And if you're going to improve the testability of the app, spend the effort on accessibility instead of making better POMs, page object models, all that stuff, um, or locating things through XPath, CSS, IDs, or data test IDs. And just you're going to get a better app, better tests, better testers, more refactoring, right? Remember how I said we changed from Angular to Vue 3? You can all devs love to reinvent a rounder wheel, right? They get to do more refactoring, right, without adjusting the tests. The tests continue to pass while they change fundamental parts of the app. And you get the, AI benefit. You get a scrapable, understandable application with the con of localization. And I can talk about that in our Q&A session. But thank you. I can hang around past the 9 o'clock mark. I know we got started a little bit late. Anybody wanted to chat about anything?
I think there's one question in the Q&A, if you'd like to answer.
Let's see. Which stack do you use to test with Screen Reader? Chrome and JAWS? So for me, this is just using. So what I would say is don't use the screen reader. That's the big thing. Don't use the screen reader, right? You you can, but if you use the accessibility tree in the Chrome DevTools, it gets you that same information very concisely, right? Very specifically, right? You get that information. So don't even use the screen reader, just use the accessibility tree. Um, what is the localization issue in your approach? Yeah. So the big thing is that if you notice in all the tests, it hard codes the name property in English, right? In English. So what if you have different languages to test, right? That's the big thing. So the problem with this approach is it means that you're functionally um, embedding English into your tests, which means that you're treating English as the only way that the app is tested. So what I would say is I would still do that, but the strategy that I would have to complement that is use the accessibility tree ARIA snapshots in your test in the other languages. So one of the cool things you can do with Playwright is you can get the accessibility tree dumped to the test. And one of the strategies you can do then is load it in Japanese, load it in Spanish, load it in whatever, and then take these ARIA snapshots and validate the text, because that's really one of the most important properties. The and then yeah, so is there an AI tool that can help us on accessibility testing? That's a really good question. I think they all do. And I think, I used it pretty heavily to understand the rules and the regulations there. I would dump code snippets in to ChatGPT or to whatever, right? And figure out like, oh, what would this do if I added this property, right? But it hallucinates. It'll hallucinate. So you got to take AI with a grain of salt. And then I do want to call out to everybody that there's an awesome Discord community to just learn about testing. And it's pasted there in the link in the chat. But yeah, if there's no other questions, thanks for letting me talk about this stuff. It's really, I'm trying to get this stuff out there, talk about accessibility and testability. And thank you for the opportunity to share this. And go take a look at OpenMCT, take a look at the tests. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, John. This was really great.